On a Tuesday morning in late 2009, a woman named Taraji P. Henson sat down with a plate of food she had not wanted to eat and forced herself to finish every bite. Not because she was hungry, not because the food tasted good, because she had finally understood that the war she had been fighting against her own body for years was one she could not win and could not afford to keep losing. She had spent the better part of a decade in Hollywood, doing what Hollywood had told her was necessary, staying small, monitoring every calorie with the precision of an accountant, treating food as a problem to be managed rather than a source of nourishment or pleasure. She had been told by people in positions of authority over her career that her body needed to be a certain shape in order for her to work. She had listened to them. And what that listening had cost her in terms of her health and her energy and her relationship with herself was something she was still calculating. She told this story publicly years later with the kind of directness that made audiences shift in their seats. Not because it was shocking in isolation, because it was recognizable. Because millions of women watching her described the experience of hating her body in a profession that had rewarded that hatred recognized the feeling she was describing from the inside. The conversation about what Hollywood has done to women's bodies is not new. What is new is the specific honesty with which women who work in that industry are now describing the experience. Not in the careful language of public relations, or in the diplomatic terms of someone who is still worried about the professional consequences of saying the wrong thing. In the direct and specific language of people who have decided that the cost of staying silent has finally exceeded the cost of speaking. This is that story, and it begins not in Hollywood, but in the specific and ancient human relationship between women and the cultural forces that have always tried to determine what women's bodies should look like. For most of human history, the body that carried cultural prestige was not the thin one. The evidence for this is visible in every major civilization that produced art. Ancient Greece gave the world sculptures of women with rounded stomachs and full thighs. Medieval European paintings depicted desirable female figures with substantial curves. The women in Rubens's canvases, who defined ideal beauty for an entire era of European culture, were fleshy and full-bodied in ways that the contemporary fashion industry would categorize without hesitation as overweight. The shift toward thinness as the culturally dominant ideal for female bodies is historically recent. It began accelerating in the 1920s when the flapper aesthetic celebrated a tubular, androgynous silhouette that deliberately erased the curves that had previously signaled femininity. It accelerated again in the 1960s with the rise of the model as cultural icon. Twiggy's 91-pound frame on magazine covers gave an entire generation of women a visual template for the body they were supposed to want. What changed along with the aesthetic was the mechanism for enforcing it. Before mass media, the standards of female beauty were relatively local. They varied by region and class and era in ways that allowed for significant diversity. Mass media collapsed that diversity into a single repeating image, the same thin body, the same particular configuration of bone and skin on every cover, in every advertisement, on every screen, presented without variation as the only body worth having. The diet industry was waiting for that image. It had been building its infrastructure for decades, but the mass media saturation of a single body type gave it something it had not previously had at that scale. A universal standard against which every other body could be measured and found wanting. The business model was simple. Make women feel inadequate relative to an image that required either genetic luck or constant costly intervention to approximate. Then sell them the intervention. The numbers that emerge from this arrangement are genuinely staggering. The global diet and weight loss industry generates revenues that exceed $250 billion annually. This figure has grown consistently for decades, regardless of economic conditions, because the psychological mechanism driving it is not affected by recessions or recoveries. Women who have been made to feel their bodies are wrong do not stop wanting to correct them when times get hard. They find ways to continue purchasing the products and services that promise correction, regardless of the cost. The cost of public health has been equally staggering and is only now beginning to be fully understood. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric condition. Anorexia nervosa kills approximately 10% of those who develop it over a 20-year period. Bulimia nervosa creates long-term physical damage to the heart, kidneys, esophagus, and teeth that persists long after the behavioral symptoms have been addressed. Binge eating disorder, which is the most prevalent eating disorder across all genders and age groups, generates a set of physical and psychological consequences that the medical community is still in the process of properly characterizing. These conditions do not emerge from nowhere. They emerge from environments, from families and cultures and industries and media ecosystems that have communicated consistently and powerfully that the body a person has is not the body they should have, that the distance between those two things is a problem to be solved, that solving it is a matter of willpower and discipline and choosing to eat differently. The eating disorder is the logical endpoint of a set of cultural messages taken seriously by a person who takes things seriously. Hollywood is not the cause of those messages, but it has been one of their most powerful amplifiers. The casting director, who told a size 6 actress that she needed to lose 15 pounds before she could be considered for a leading role, was not operating in isolation. She was applying an industry standard that had been established and maintained over decades by a network of studios and agencies and producers and costume departments and entertainment journalists and award show presenters who had collectively decided what bodies were allowed to be visible in American culture and which ones were not. The consequences of that decision lived in the bodies of the women who worked in the industry. In the meal skipping, that became normal. In the extreme exercise that was maintained at levels that would be diagnosed as compulsive if they occurred outside the context of a professional that required a certain appearance. In the stimulant use that was widespread and openly discussed in certain circles as a method of appetite management. In the diet pills and the juice cleanses and the extreme restriction and the constant monitoring of intake that had become so normalized within the industry that pointing it out felt unnecessary because everyone already knew. Jennifer Lawrence changed something when she refused to lose weight for the Hunger Games, not because she was the first actress to hold a line about her body, because she was the first actress at that level of cultural visibility to articulate specifically what she was refusing and why. She said in interviews during the press cycle for that film that she had been told she was overweight for Hollywood. She said she looked around at teenagers and decided she did not want to be a role model for young women by portraying that message with her body. She said she would rather be called fat in the press than send the message that the body she had was not acceptable. The press called her fat, extensively and specifically. Reviews of her performance were accompanied by descriptions of her body that had nothing to do with her acting. Entertainment journalists wrote think pieces about her size. The internet generated content about whether she was appropriate for a role that required her character to be malnourished. And then something unexpected happened. She won the Oscar. The film grossed almost $700 million. Young women wrote her letters describing what it had meant to see a body that looked like theirs in a role that was heroic and central rather than sidekick or comic relief or the fat friend who existed to make the thin lead look better by comparison. The industry noticed, not because it had developed moral commitments it had not previously held, because the commercial data contradicted the assumption that audiences required thin bodies in order to purchase tickets. Lizzo's cultural moment arrived as a demonstration of the same principle at a different register. A woman whose body was everything. The fashion industry had spent decades telling women they needed to prevent their bodies from becoming, was performing songs about loving herself, and her audience was selling out arenas and buying albums and streaming her music at numbers that made every argument about whether her body was commercially viable look exactly as absurd as it had always been. The hostility she encountered was real and specific and unrelenting. Comments about her health, articles about whether she was sending a dangerous message, the specific and documented pattern of the internet, identifying bodies that violate established beauty standards and generating coordinated attacks designed to return them to compliance or silence. What Lizzo did with the hostility was important. She did not hide from it. She did not pretend it was not happening. She incorporated it directly into her work. She named it. She described her experience of it specifically. She documented in real time the process of choosing to love herself in an environment specifically designed to make that choice difficult. The result was an artist whose connection to her audience was built not on the aspirational distance that traditional celebrity requires, but on the radical intimacy of shared experience. The women who bought her albums and filled her concert venues were not watching someone achieve something they could not. They were watching someone do something they were also trying to do in their own lives, and finding in her the reflection of their own struggle made visible and survivable. The body positive movement that had been building through social media channels across the 2010s was not a new idea. It traced its roots to the fat liberation movement of the late 1960s and 1970s, when activists began publicly challenging the medical and cultural frameworks that had pathologized larger bodies. What was new was the scale of distribution that social media provided. Images and essays and personal testimonies that would previously have reached a few hundred people through zines or community publications could now reach hundreds of thousands within days. The platform dynamics of Instagram in particular created something unprecedented. Women who had spent their entire lives surrounded primarily by images of bodies that did not resemble their own could suddenly curate a visual environment that reflected a much wider range of human forms. Plus, size bloggers built audiences in the millions. Body positive accounts generated engagement numbers that began attracting advertising dollars. The market that the fashion industry had told itself did not exist revealed itself to be enormous and underserved. The response from the fashion industry was revealing in its limitations. Brands that had previously communicated that their clothing was intended for bodies below a certain size began adding size-inclusive ranges. Some of them did this sincerely and structurally with actual investment in plus-size design. Others added a few extended sizes and photographed them on models who remained within a very narrow range of the traditional thin ideal, communicating extension while maintaining exclusion. The consumers they were trying to reach were sophisticated enough to tell the difference. The brands that invested genuinely in the change built genuine loyalty. The brands that performed inclusivity without delivering it generated a specific kind of backlash that the social media environment amplified efficiently and effectively. The medical system has its own history in this story, a history that is significantly more complicated than either its champions or its critics tend to acknowledge. The body mass index, or BMI, was developed in the 19th century by a Belgian statistician named Adolf Quetelet. It was designed as a population-level statistical tool for describing distributions in large groups. It was explicitly not designed for individual medical assessment. Quetelet himself said so clearly. The measure could not and should not be used to indicate levels of fatness in individuals. The history of how a population-level statistical tool became the primary metric through which American medicine evaluates individual bodies is a history of convenience overriding accuracy. BMI required only height and weight, both easily measured in any clinical setting. It produced a single number that could be recorded in a chart and compared across populations. It provided the appearance of objectivity that medicine has always sought when making judgments about bodies that are much more complex than any single measurement can capture. The limitation that Quetelet identified when he invented the measure never went away. BMI does not distinguish between fat and muscle. It does not account for where fat is distributed in the body, which has significant implications for health outcomes. It does not account for age or sex or race or ethnicity, despite the fact that research has documented that the health implications of different BMI values differ across these categories. A measure that cannot distinguish between a competitive athlete and a sedentary person of similar height and weight is not a precise diagnostic tool. The medical weight loss industry has been built on the authority that BMI provides. Diagnoses of overweight and obesity based on BMI thresholds drive referrals to weight loss programs and prescriptions for weight loss medications and surgical recommendations that generate hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. The accuracy of the underlying diagnostic tool has been questioned in the medical literature for decades. The commercial infrastructure built on that tool has not significantly responded to those questions. The GLP-1 medications that entered the weight loss market in force beginning in the early 2020s created a new chapter in this story that is still being written. Semaglutide, sold under brand names including Ozempic and Wegovy, produced weight loss at a scale that exceeded anything the weight loss industry had previously been able to offer. The results were genuine and in some cases dramatic. The medications also came with side effects and questions about long-term safety that a relatively short period of widespread use could not fully answer. The cultural conversation that emerged around these medications revealed the depth of the anxiety that surrounds bodies in American culture. Celebrity bodies that had changed substantially within short time frames were examined and analyzed in entertainment media with an intensity that had no parallel in the coverage of any other medical treatment. The specific size of a famous woman's body was treated as a matter of public interest and public commentary in ways that the use of any other medication would not have been. Ozempic became a cultural flashpoint not because of anything specific to its pharmacology, but because it arrived at a moment when the question of what women's bodies should look like and who had the right to determine the answer had become genuinely contested in ways it had not been for much of the preceding century. The eating disorder community watched the emergence of these medications with a mixture of hope and alarm. Hope, because some of the research suggested potential applications for binge eating disorder. Alarm, because the medications entered a cultural environment where the desire for thinness was already pathological in scale, and the enthusiasm with which they were adopted reflected not just legitimate medical need, but the depth of the cultural wound around body size that had been accumulating for decades. The specific harm of the online diet culture ecosystem that had developed across social media platforms during the 2010s was different in character from the harm of earlier media. Television and magazines presented thin bodies as aspirational images. They were passive. You looked at them and they communicated a standard. The social media ecosystem created a participatory environment. You did not just receive the standard, you participated in enforcing it. You commented on other people's bodies. You compared your food diary to someone else's food diary. You tracked your intake and your output and your measurements and shared them in communities where others did the same and where numbers were compared and the thinner number was always the better number. The specific online communities that emerged around extreme restriction developed their own languages and their own hierarchies and their own support structures that could provide the feeling of belonging. And community that is a fundamental human need while simultaneously reinforcing behaviors that were medically dangerous. The research into how these communities operated showed clearly that participation in them was associated with worse eating disorder outcomes. The communities continued to exist because the platforms that hosted them had limited ability or limited willingness to intervene effectively. The women who recovered from eating disorders and began speaking publicly about their experiences created a counter ecosystem. recovery accounts that documented not just the behavioral changes of eating disorder recovery, but the psychological and emotional dimensions of it. The specific work of learning to tolerate a body that the culture had taught you to hate. The process of rebuilding a relationship with food that had become entirely divorced from pleasure or nourishment. The grief of realizing how much time and energy and mental space the disorder had consumed. This community also became large and active. The women who found each other in it described the experience of recovery as one that was significantly harder than the formal eating disorder treatment they had received, because the culture they were recovering within continued to communicate the same messages that had contributed to the disorder in the first place. Recovery required not just changing behavior, but developing the capacity to live in a world that was still actively organized around the premise that smaller was better, and that the desire to be smaller was rational and healthy, and the appropriate baseline orientation of a woman toward her own body. The nutrition science that should have been providing a stable factual foundation for this conversation has not been able to play that role clearly, because nutrition science has its own complicated history. The relationship between dietary fat and cardiovascular disease that dominated nutritional guidance for decades was based on research that has been substantially revised. The war on fat that shaped American dietary guidelines and food production practices from the 1970s onward contributed to the rise of processed food products that replaced fat with sugar in ways that generated their own set of health consequences. The relationship between caloric intake and weight that forms the conceptual basis of most weight loss interventions turns out to be mediated by factors including gut microbiome composition and hormonal regulation, and sleep quality and stress levels that the simple calories in calories out model does not capture. Bodies do not respond uniformly to identical caloric conditions. The metabolic consequences of restriction are complex and often work against the outcomes that restriction is intended to produce. None of this has fully penetrated the popular conversation about bodies and food and weight. The cultural stories are older and more emotionally resonant than the scientific literature, and they move through the culture on different timescales. A person who grew up understanding that a smaller body was a better body does not revise that belief, because a meta-analysis of nutrition studies produces a more nuanced picture of what drives body weight. The work of changing the culture moves through individuals and through representation and through the accumulation of many small acts of honesty about what the existing culture has cost. Taraji P. Henson describing what she had done to her body to stay employable in Hollywood. Jennifer Lawrence refusing to lose weight and being called fat for it and winning the Oscar. Anyway, Lizzo performing for sold-out arenas in a body that the fashion industry had written off, and building an audience that the industry had told itself did not exist. Each of these is a data point, a piece of evidence that the story being told about women's bodies has not been the true story, that the market for bodies outside the standard has not been the niche market it was represented as being, that the women who occupied those bodies were not invisible or unimportant or commercially uninteresting. They were simply not being shown to themselves. The question of where this goes is genuinely open. The body positive movement has made the visibility of diverse bodies in media and fashion more normal than it was a decade ago. The specific industries most responsible for amplifying the thin ideal are in the process of revising their visual language in ways that range from sincere to performative. The medical establishment is under increasing pressure to address the limitations of BMI as a diagnostic tool and to grapple with the research literature on weight stigma and its health consequences. The eating disorder crisis is not resolved. The rates of eating disorders in the adolescent population increased substantially during the pandemic years and have not returned to pre-pandemic levels. The online environments in which young women are spending their developmental years continue to generate social comparison pressures that the research literature associates with worse body image outcomes. The cultural forces that produce eating disorders remain more powerful than the treatment infrastructure that addresses their consequences. What has changed is the availability of honest testimony. The women who have experienced the specific harm of a culture organized around the premise that their bodies needed to be different are speaking about that experience in public with a directness and a specificity that was not available or acceptable in previous generations. The testimony is accumulating. The stories are finding each other. The picture that emerges from them is a picture of a harm that has been systematic and widespread and largely invisible because it was normalized into the background of ordinary experience. Taraji P. Henson, finishing that plate of food she did not want to eat on a Tuesday morning in late 2009, was not a dramatic public act. It was a private one. It happened without an audience and without documentation. But it was part of the same story that produces the public acts. The public refusals and the honest interviews and the sold-out arenas and the audit covers and the policy changes and the slow revision of what a culture believes about the bodies of women. The story is not finished. It is not close to finished. The forces that have organized American culture around the thin female body as the only body worth having have not dissolved. They have simply encountered more organized resistance than they previously faced. The resistance is the story, the accumulation of individual acts of honesty about what the existing standard has cost. The women who refused to continue paying that cost. The audiences who responded to those refusals, not with confusion or commercial indifference, but with a specific recognition of people who had been waiting for someone to say out loud what they had known privately for a long time. The body that a woman has is the body she has. Not a problem, not a project, not a before photo, not evidence of inadequate willpower or insufficient discipline or wrong choices. A body, doing what bodies do, carrying a person through time, and deserving of the basic dignity that all things deserve that have been doing their work faithfully and without adequate acknowledgement for far too long. That is not a revolutionary proposition. It is the proposition that a significant portion of American culture has spent the better part of a century organizing itself to resist. The resistance to the resistance continues. So does the resistance itself. And somewhere, a woman is sitting down with a plate of food she has decided to eat. Not because she has been told to, because she has decided that the war was not one she was going to keep fighting. That decision is not the end of anything, but it is a beginning. And beginnings, even the quiet private ones that happen without witnesses on ordinary Tuesday mornings, are where everything starts.